In the first methods module, I explained that representativeness represents the degree to which the sample represents the population. That influences the knowledge we can gain from a study and, given that, can influence the scientific credibility of a study. If we question the representativeness of a study, we can also question whether there's a characteristic of the sample that creates an alternative explanation for the results. If we decide the sample does represent the population, thinking about representativeness can lead to questions about whether the results will apply to other populations. Before we get that deep though, it might be helpful if I walk you through how to figure out the population and what to consider to determine the representativeness. I'll continue using the slumped and upright postures article to demonstrate how to apply the concepts and think through the related ideas. It's somewhat unusual for an article to include a statement like, the population of interest was, so we usually have to draw a conclusion based on the way they talk about the study in the title and the abstract, and in explaining the focus of the study. That means we'll look at the title and abstract we copied to the summary worksheet, and at section 2 of that worksheet. When we're looking at the title and abstract, we're looking to see if the authors mention any particular group of people. The title of the article about slumped and upright postures is, Do Slumped and Upright Postures Affect the Stress Response? A Randomized Trial. That doesn't identify a specific group, just the variables and the type of study conducted. The only people mentioned in the abstract are the participants, and that's in the context of how they conducted the study. Similarly, the hypotheses that were the focus of the article don't refer to any particular group of people. Given that, they don't seem to have a specific group they're interested in understanding. It appears they just want to add to knowledge about people in general. To draw a conclusion about the representativeness of this particular study, we're asking, how well does the sample represent all people? Your initial instinct might be to say, probably not very well. That's a large group to represent. Good point. We can get more specific by looking at the sampling process and characteristics of the sample, though. This article didn't include many details about the sampling process, but we do know it took place in Auckland, which is in New Zealand. So we could question whether there are cultural differences that might influence how people respond to stress, and might not make the findings applicable in other cultures. The sample was only 74 people, but that doesn't necessarily limit representativeness. In this case, it might make us more skeptical, though, because it's a pretty small portion of all the people in the world. It's probably a pretty small portion of Auckland residents, too. The sample was 55% females, so it didn't include a substantially larger group of females, which would create questions about representativeness. Participants ranged from 18 to 67 years old, but the mean was 26, so older people might not have been as well represented. They also excluded a few groups of people from the study. Having musculoskeletal, cardiovascular, or dermatological conditions probably wouldn't influence the relationship between stress and posture, so that probably wouldn't influence representativeness. They also excluded people with a diagnosed mental disorder, though, and that might be related to the stress response. When I think about all those details, it leads me to the conclusion that this study might not represent all people in general, mainly because of the potential cultural and age-related differences. But there's also the question of whether excluding people with a diagnosed mental disorder influenced anything. That doesn't mean the findings are worthless, though. It just reminds us that we need to be cautious about how we think about them. I'll explain more about that in the recording about how the results add to our knowledge. To come to a conclusion about representativeness, we have to start by determining the population. Sometimes the title, abstract, and focus of the article will refer to a particular group, but often, like in the slumped and upright article, the researchers are thinking about people in general, but they don't really mention that. Once we've come to a conclusion about the population, we can consider the characteristics of the sample and how it compares to the population. Many studies use non-probability convenient samples, so it's not uncommon for the representativeness to be somewhat low. That doesn't mean that the results are worthless, though, and we just have to be a little bit more tentative in how we think about them.